It was just a normal day on Twitter. Another day, another controversy. This time, a new Class of '09 game. And the fans aren't happy about it. I, for one, have never played the Class of '09 games, but out of curiosity and because some of the clips I saw were pretty funny, I decided to play through them to see what's up. What happened next was tragic. I really enjoyed them. Despite being well aware of the things people were saying about the third game, I was wholeheartedly enjoying the series, and just hoping the finale wouldn't be as bad as literally everyone said. It was a mistake I would live to regret. But why? Why am I making an entire video about some visual novel game roughly 0% of my audience will care about? Well, it's not every day you see a competent series crumble overnight. Especially one in a genre as simple as the visual novel. There's barely any gameplay to begin with. How could you possibly fuck it up? The case of this series is really interesting to me. How one bad installment can completely undermine an entire series of games. And if you think I'm exaggerating, then maybe you should keep watching.
If you just don't engage with other people's emotions or desires, nothing's a
They
burden.
can manipulate me by pretending to care about my taste in music. If I ever see her talk like that to you again, I will rip her feet
Yeah, I know. What were the writers thinking?
I've seen many draw comparisons between Class of '09 and Doki Doki Literature Club, and while the comparisons aren't unwarranted, they share a lot in common, I think it's also important to highlight the key way in which they differ. Both of these games are subversions of the main genre visual novels are associated with, but in different ways. Doki Doki is the subversion of a genre's expectations. Most visual novels fall into the genre of dating sim, so its cutesy aesthetic is to be expected, the subversion shining through in the darker turn the game takes. It's still a dating sim, but its tone takes a more horrifying meta approach around that framework. The game knows that the one source of influence you have over it, making choices, can be tampered with to induce horror. Class of '09 is also a subversion, but instead of adding to the conventions of a dating sim, playing around with and altering the idea, Class of '09 takes the exact opposite approach. The game acts as a visual novel for people who hate visual novels. And the game actively shits on the exact people that like visual novels to begin with through Jeffrey, the stereotypical nerd character who constantly gets bullied for liking anime. You know, the style of the game he's in. Instead of subverting the tropes, ultimately the approach the game takes is to flat out reject it. Something that's equally as abundant in the actual game. In Class of '09, you follow Nicole, a self-described sociopath who after moving to a new town has to navigate the perils of the American school system, and all the challenges that brings. It's a game that, at first glance, looks unflattering. Its ugly-looking graphics being the main visuals was the main reason I put off playing it until the last possible moment. From an outsider's perspective, it seems like nothing special. So why did people care about Class of '09? In my opinion, there are two main reasons Class of '09 works. Its style, and comedy. In terms of visual design, the game perfectly captures the late 2000s. It extrudes from every aspect of the game, from name-dropping MySpace and using flip phones to the actual look of the graphics. Whether you like it or not, the game completely nails the style it sets out to capture. The anime-styled characters clash heavily with the photographic backgrounds in a very jarring way, and even the characters look a bit awkward with their thinner line width than you might expect. They look like characters you'd see in one of those how to draw manga books, and it complements the style because it almost looks like the game could have been designed by a high school student. Then there's its unique brand of comedy. I've seen many describe this game as the Boondocks for white lesbians. Now, I'm not a lesbian, last time I checked, but the Boondocks is one of my favorite shows of all time, and while its satire of American culture is a lot more cleanly executed, both pieces of media have some insanely funny and out-of-pocket jokes, made even better by the delivery of the voice actors presenting them.
Wait a minute. I'm white!
Now these two factors aren't the only things Class of '09 brings to the table. There are other aspects to the game, like its characters and story, but frankly, neither of those alone are enough to make the game what it is. While people like the characters, they mostly boil down to a handful of traits each. And in the first game at least, it's really hard to connect with the story, as it's surface level and just not long enough to really connect to, with certain endings taking as little as 15 minutes to complete. Because of the structure of the game, if you don't really commit to a route, paths you go down are closed and never brought up again. In that sense, the game is more of an anthology of mini-stories than one cohesive narrative. But where the story does shine is in its sheer entertainment value. Going down these alternative paths and comparing them is intuitively fun. But more importantly, it's the perfect vessel for the banter and humor to make its mark. When you aren't that attached to the characters, it puts the emphasis on the jokes around them. And depending on your sense of humor, it makes or breaks the game. Nearly all of the students in this high school are terrible people, but watching terrible people do terrible things is just really fun. Usually when bad things happen in certain routes, you don't really feel bad because those results seem more like the consequences of your actions. In the second game, there's a route where Nicole literally ruins someone's relationship because they were too bossy in drama class, and it's morbidly entertaining. Speaking of that second game, 2 years after the first, a sequel called The Re-Up was released on Steam. It takes place in the same setting, generally around the same time, but has different routes you could choose to go down. Fundamentally, it's the same game, but its differences come together to surpass the original. It matches the 2009 aesthetic, while being generally funnier and having longer storylines. Its themes also take a slight turn. The first game rewards you for being a terrible person. As a general trend, the best outcomes for Nicole involve her using the people around her, lying about a teacher committing crimes, convincing Kyler to jump from the school, both of these leading to the best endings. In Re-Up, some of Nicole's actions get called out.
Nicole, this might be a weird question, but did you cry at all after your mom died?
No, but I used it to get out of some stuff. Does that count?
You seriously need to be on something.
In an interview, it's explained that the intent with the game has shifted. The first one is described as Hot Girl Simulator, where you make choices and watch the consequences. Then the sequel goes more in depth with its world building and a closer focus on specific stories. By the Re-Up's release, the series had already garnered a small but dedicated following. But a few months after its release, it would see the attention of a much wider audience than anyone would have expected. Specifically, the game became a hit on TikTok. Ari being the most sympathetic character in the series, the TikTok fandom took a particular liking to, although a lot of the time they would overlook the character's own shortcomings. Now, I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of the newer fans didn't like the series for the same reasons. The dark comedy specifically, leaving their focus on the aesthetic and characters. This actually makes a lot of sense. If there's one thing Gen Z is known for, it's for their feelings of anemoia. Feelings of nostalgia for times they weren't there to experience. And as for the characters, shipping became ever more popular, especially since they're all already kinda queer-coded.
You're not gonna kiss me goodnight?
Oh my god. Mwah.
Thanks. I love you.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, they were still genuine fans of the series, people who sincerely cared about the world and characters. And they'd all be around to see it come crashing down. That position is the most baffling part of this. The visual novel format is so simple that most couldn't possibly imagine how someone who did it well twice could possibly fumble the bag in the finale of their trilogy. It's the end of the story, the final chance to see these characters in game. This is the FlipSide, the game that ruined everything. You might as well turn back now. Here's where the game peaks. Never again will it live up to its predecessors. Experiencing the FlipSide's flaws is a slow burn, and that's the most evil thing about it. On the surface, it just looks like another game. Same graphics, same gameplay. The majority of outsiders looking in won't notice a difference. The Steam page looks fine besides that little blemish. But the longer you watch, and watch, and watch, and... hey, why am I just watching anyway? Where's the choice part of the game? You know, the whole reason visual novels exist? Well, to start, even at the most surface level, FlipSide is the weakest game of the series, having these long, drawn-out cutscenes over several scenes with absolutely no control of which choices are made. This is continuing a trend the first two games had. The first game had by far the most options, but it still had about 3.5 hours of content, with some endings only taking about 15 minutes and feeling rushed because of it. To remedy this, the second game has about half the endings, but the trade-off is that there's a greater focus on the stories, and they're more engaging because of that. The characters are a little more layered now, and the increased time makes it easier to get attached to the stories. The third game follows this trend, but takes it way too far. There are so few choices and such long cutscenes between them that you might as well just watch a playthrough on YouTube. With that surface level fundamental flaw explained, let's actually get into the game. In this one you play as Jekka, Nicole's best friend, and have to navigate her life after high school. This is an idea that might work in concept, but falls flat in practice. Even in the older games, Nicole has always been a pretty awful person. But again, so is almost everyone in the series, and that's why it's enjoyable. But being a visual novel, the player was always the one in control of her decisions. In that sense, she's less of a character and more of a blank slate to experience the world. Using her as a vessel to watch different choices play out, for the better, but usually for the worse. With Jekka as the main character, Nicole is free to do whatever she'd naturally do, and that usually means the worst thing possible at any given time. In previous games, Jekka is the more morally responsible of the two, even calling out Nicole for doing certain actions.
Are you seriously not getting how bad this is?
How bad what is?
You bullying a gay girl into being straight?
When Jekka's the puppet, Nicole's free to be evil without the player's satisfaction of being the one to decide that. You could argue it was meant to be that way, to show that it doesn't feel too good when you're the one being messed with. But I feel like everyone already knows that. That's why we're making terrible decisions in-game rather than in real life. And besides, if anyone deserves a bad ending, it'd probably be Nicole. Why would a character who's comparatively done relatively nothing wrong have to be punished for the actions of a completely different character? I've been pretty negative so far, so I only think it's fair to talk about the best and probably only good ending in the game. In all the games, after completing an ending, you're given a text message, usually providing context of what happens after it ends. And that framework leads to the most minute, yet powerful moment. The only thing in any of these games that I genuinely emotionally resonated with. In the first game, if you try to appease everyone, it doesn't really work out. This culminates in a terrible situation where everyone turns on Nicole, and she ultimately gives up on life. After watching the final cutscene, you get a message from Jekka that reads, "Hey, miss you. I'm sorry." For such a small piece of world building, it adds so much realism to the ending. It reminds you that these people will continue existing, having to carry the baggage of what you did. A reminder like this genuinely could have been the thing that stops any one of the depressed Zoomers who played it from really going through with it. If there's one moment from the series that should be expanded upon, it's exactly this. Luckily for us, in the flip side, we get to view Jekka's perspective of this event, and her coming to terms with the fact that she's gonna have to continue living. And it's one of the best moments in the game. One small problem though. In order to get to that point, you have to go through an excruciating route where you date an abusive teacher and have your life ruined. It's miserable, and doesn't even really add to the ending it's attached to. This game as a whole suffers from that problem. It's just miserable to watch half the stuff that happens. In the first two games, you're navigating high school and exploring the wacky possibilities of paths you can go down. Here, every path just sucks to watch. The story generally seems to just hate Jekka as a character. All things considered, her entire end goal is literally just to exist, to get a job, not be abused, and eventually go to college. I don't even like Jekka, but what part of these motivations scream, "Ah, yes, she deserves this"? And the nail in the coffin is that there isn't even a bare minimum good ending where she gets what little things she wants. No reward for getting through the suffering. To be clear, I'm not mad at the story for only having bad endings. One of my favorite endings has Nicole dead. But the endings we do get feel undeserved and unsatisfying. I think there's a clear difference between dark comedy and just being dark. There isn't a single scene with Jekka's dad that's remotely funny. Maybe the joke is that no matter what, he yells and threatens her with no warning, but that's just not entertaining. But you know who does seem to find it funny? The developer of the game.
Is there a spider in the corner of my eye?
You're not even listening! That's it!
There were like 3 other people in this call and none of them were laughing. It's only entertaining to him. Something like this would have been saved as a punishment in the other 2 games, but here you encounter it throughout the story no matter which route you choose. And yes, it's alluded to in the other games, but that's just another reason Jekka sucks as a protagonist. The FlipSide didn't add dark moments so much as it subtracted comedic ones, and because of that, it's a slog to get through. At best, it's boring, but usually it's just kinda sad to watch, aside from the rare comedic gem.
What are you doing here?
Oh, I'm the Hat Man. You have any Benadryl?
No, I took it all.
Damn, every time I show up, too.
Another one of the better endings is the car crash ending. By better, I solely mean that it's one of the less terrible in this game, because again, there isn't really a good ending like in the other games. In this ending, you get into a car crash after drunk driving, and you crash into fan-favorite character Ari, who was literally just at the wrong place at the wrong time. I theorize the choice to kill off Ari is intentional, as despite her own character hang-ups, she's mostly seen as perfect and pure by the community on TikTok. I don't see any objective issues here, but it does clue me in on a potential motive for why the game is how it is. Now that I've gone over some of its other issues, let's talk about the big one. If you've heard any of the discourse around this game, you've probably heard the main thing people are talking about. Its strange focus on feet. This game feels uniquely dated. Trapped, not in 2009, but rather 2020. All the foot stuff just reminds me of modern day OnlyFans culture. It's legitimately immersion breaking, both because it's weird and sudden, but also because it completely takes you out of the atmosphere. I've seen people try to defend the weird shit in this game, or use it to criticize the rest of the series, claiming that the foot endings are comparable to other questionable paths you can take in the other games. But the difference to me is simple. In the first game, you have the option to date the creepy gym coach. If you ignore the obvious red flags and go through with it, he either gets arrested and the game continues, or it leads to an ending where he murders you. It's one ending out of 15, and it's one of the worst outcomes for Nicole, even in a game with other bad endings. So yeah, that stuff is weird, but the game had the self-awareness to punish you for going down that route. Even in other taboo paths, like the 3 white nationalist endings, they're a little excessive, but in the context of the game it actually makes narrative sense. In that route, you do a photo shoot with Mr. White, and then you find out about his beliefs, and you can choose to confront him to move on with the rest of the story. Those other routes are punishments to the player for choosing to ignore it instead of confronting it. Jekka, who gets swayed to the dark side, or maybe it's the light side in this case, literally mentions the exact argument that Nicole shuts down in the other outcome.
Like, he asked me why it's okay to do Black Pride and Mexican Pride.
Well, there's Black Pride, that's fine. How is White Pride any different?
Proud about what? You already own everything. It's just a victory lap.
So yeah, the amount of endings is excessive, but no matter what, it ends poorly for the group, and it's satisfying to see the different ways their movement falls apart. Let's compare this to the FlipSide. If you go down one of the 2 choices at the beginning of the game, the weird kid Jeffrey offers to pay you a ton of money to step on him. Choosing to do so leads you down the feet meet route, which ultimately can result in 2 different endings, neither of which are even close to being good. 2 endings already seems like a lot to devote to this. But hey, if the White Pride Party gets 3 endings, then I guess that's fair. Wait, how many total endings does FlipSide even have? Oh, it has 5 endings. The Choose Your Own Adventure game has 5 endings, so that means nearly half the content, 40% of the whole fucking game, is this.
I like a girl that takes good care of her feet. Yours are so nice and soft.
Oh yeah?
I just want to carry you everywhere, so you never need to rough these up a day in your life.
The first game has 15 endings. Even if you choose to ignore Mr. White entirely, you still have more than enough game to explore. Okay, let's just try to avoid this. What if we tell Jeffrey to fuck off and continue as normal? Well, we work at a DVD store, go on a scavenger hunt for a missing paycheck, and oh wow, Jekka gets trafficked. That's right, not only is more than one ending dedicated to feet, but even if you choose not to go down that route, you get the absolute worst ending possible. Really worth punishing the player for not indulging in these weird fantasies. I think at its core the problem is this. The FlipSide is a failure. As a finale, as a Class of 09 game, and even as a visual novel altogether. And worst of all, it actually damages your perception of the games before it. And that might have been intentional. As it turns out, a lot of the serious flaws in FlipSide are still easily noticeable in the other games. It was just more subtle. Playing the first game in a vacuum, you can easily ignore this strange recurring focus, writing these off as weird one-off jokes. But when you do it for half the game, it's a lot less subtle. No matter how many occasional lines you do calling it weird, there's still fully illustrated custom scenes just to really get the point across. Some might call it shock value, but there's nothing shocking about this. The pieces were already there. After the release of this game, a former friend of SBN3 hosted a Reddit Q&A where he answers some of the questions regarding FlipSide and the rest of the series, and provides answers that shine a lot of light on the inner workings of the creator of the games. Yeah, I didn't mention it until now, but the Class of 09 games were made by this dude's soul brother number 3, usually simplified to just SBN3. He's someone who's been on the internet for a while, and because of that, there are some videos of him being kind of a dick, to put it lightly. There's a whole bunch of other stuff about him, but I'd rather focus on some of the things from this Q&A. The answers that reframe the context about the previous game's development, going from a fun, nostalgic dark comedy game to a cringe power fantasy because SBN wanted to be the rejecter instead of the rejected. Basically, he's Jeffrey trying to be Nicole. So with that additional context, here's what I think happened. In late 2023, the re-up would be found by its unintended audience of TikTok Zoomers. SBN, who made the game as a dark comedy for adults, would slowly turn on this newfound audience. He was at the height of his popularity as a creator, but he was mad that people would rather choose to ship his characters than to engage with the darker tones of the game. This would frustrate him to no end, so much to the point of making an entire installment just to alienate the very audience that appreciated his work to begin with. The very audience that could have legitimately benefited from some of its messaging. Well, it worked. And it also scared away anyone who had a vested interest in anything the games represented. When the other two games do terrible things, they're punishments. Here, they just call it the story. Because the whole game is a punishment. A punishment to the fanbase for ever choosing to care in the first place. And when you're punished for caring, don't be surprised when people start to lose interest. Hopefully I didn't come across as too angry in this video. The last thing I want is for this to come across as a Mr. Enter-esque rant about a stupid anime game I hadn't heard of until a week ago. I'm just a new fan, disappointed by the way this game completely dropped the ball at the last possible moment. It could have been a melancholic story about friends drifting apart and moving on with their lives after high school, something I myself relate to, having graduated earlier this year. But instead, it ended with a whimper. Specifically Jeffrey's whimper, as he indulges in toes. Whatever. I guess I'll see you on the flip side.
So long.
Hey, Nicole. I know it's late, but I just had the craziest nightmare. I was like, it's foggy now, but I think it had something to do with feet. Yeah, it was like really weird and unpleasant. Sorry for waking you up. See you at school tomorrow.